Today we're going to be covering the historical kingdoms. We're going to do a historical overview of the period that directly follows the death of Alexander the Great. So we spent a number of sessions on the classical era. And the classical era, again, ran from 480 BC to 323 BC with the death of Alexander. And he had conquered, by that point, the entire ancient Persian Empire, forming at that point the largest empire that had ever been known on the earth. But what happened with his death prematurely, right, he was in his 30s, early 30s when he passed away, is that he left an empire without any clear plan for succession. That led to chaos. And the area we're about to discuss is an incredibly chaotic era. Throughout my entire college career, when we were going through Greek history courses, I don't think I've had a single Greek history professor that ever covered the Hellenistic era. We'd cover it in my archaeology classes, but whether it was undergraduate or graduate school, it seemed like the professors of Greek history generally got bored once we got to Alexander the Great and definitely didn't touch the material that followed him. And I think it was for maybe two reasons. Number one, it's not strictly speaking a purely Greek era anymore. It's going to be called Hellenistic for a reason. I'm going to define that term in just a little bit. But the second reason might be because this is a chaotic period. It's a period that you might not even be that interested in if you're not interested in battles and war and back and forth ambitions of, megalomaniac figures. So what I'm going to try to do as I lay out this particular time period is simplify it as best I can. Obviously, we're going to need to talk about wars, and a lot of names are going to be thrown around, so it might be a little bit difficult to follow who's who. And I'm probably not going to go off on very many rabbit trails, hopefully, only to make sure that it's less confusing than it could be otherwise. So here's the way I'm going to proceed. We're going to cover the death of Alexander, the breakup of his empire, and we're going to try to look at the big figures, the major generals, and the territories that break off, forming what are called the Hellenistic kingdoms, focusing in ultimately on the three largest of the Hellenistic kingdoms. And in the course of going through the few centuries, basically 3 centuries worth of history, we're going to be slowly introducing Rome. Right now, Rome technically isn't a Hellenistic kingdom. It's not a territory that was ever conquered by Alexander the Great, though there are rumors that he had plans on conquering Italy, never got there. Those might not actually be actual plans that he had, but there was speculation in the ancient world about that. But Rome is going to be something we're going to spend a lot of time on after this lecture. As a matter of fact, the very next historical period is going to be the beginning of Rome. So we're going to have to do a little bit of a recap, go back. But I'm going to introduce them today with respect to their involvement in the Hellenistic world. Okay, so let's dig in, do our historical overview of the Hellenistic kingdoms. This is going to be 323 BC to 30 BC. Now, let's just go through a few terms. The Greeks we've already introduced. This is the Indo-European people that had settled in the mainland world of modern Greece, the Aegean Sea, scattered out throughout the Mediterranean, particularly during the era of colonization, which we looked at during the Archaic period. So they're going to have a huge impact and have already had a huge impact on the culture of the Mediterranean. But at this point in time, we're looking at them as a group of people primarily under the domination of the Macedonians, which were in the northern portion of Greece. I'm going to give you a few maps in a second. The Greek culture at this period is being exported from Greeks to non-Greeks. So we're going to call this era not the Hellenic period, but we're going to refer to it as the Hellenistic period. And the word Hellenistic refers to the culture of the late 4th century as it's mixing and mingling with the Near Eastern and Egyptian cultures. Okay, so we can translate Hellenistic something like Greek, kind of a Greekish type of a culture, okay, for lack of a better translation. So that's the period we're focusing in today. Let's go back, take a look at a few maps, because we always want to remember where we're talking so that you don't lose your orientation. And I'm going to circle here. This is a picture of the map as we left it at the time of Alexander the Great's death. This is the extent of Alexander the Great's empire from Greece on the western border and India on the eastern border. Macedonia up there around the orange. You can see the circled areas showing up on the map, hopefully clear enough. I know this is not the largest map, but that would be the homeland of the Macedonians, obviously. Anatolia, modern Turkey, also called Asia Minor. Syria, right below, coming down the Levant coast, and then Palestine, the lower portion of that, which would include the territory of Judah or Judea. Mesopotamia, where we start in the entire semester between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. That's in the light blue. That might be the hardest color to see. Persia, we're just going to say this is the largest chunk of territory between India and Mesopotamia, though it actually includes a number of smaller regions like Bactria and places like that. We're just going to call the whole thing Persia for our purposes. Keep it as simple as we can. And then Egypt in North Africa. Now, all of those territories are partitioned after the death of Alexander the Great. And as a matter of fact, we could probably break the territory down into even smaller units because Alexander had many generals and there were many little pieces carved out by them. But like I said, we're going to simplify the matter and focus in on certain select regions and certain select cities, I should probably throw in at this point as well. The most important cities of the Hellenistic era, for whatever reason, whether they're a capital of a kingdom or a center of learning. So we'll probably focus more on the centers of learning. Athens, and you could see these kind of show up on this new map in the little, I was going to say diamond, what is that called? A little star that shows up on the map in white. Okay, so Athens we know a lot about already. We spent a lot of the time of the Hellenistic overview focusing on the city of Athens, particularly with their relationship with Sparta. But Athens remains a very important city in the Hellenistic era, not as a political power or the leader of an empire, though they will rise periodically to challenge the Macedonians to the north. They are never going to become the power that they once were, but they will remain an important center for philosophy. You had the Academy, you had the Lyceum, the schools of Plato, the school of Aristotle, and you're going to have other schools spring up during the Hellenistic period, which we're going to look at probably in our next session or next couple sessions. Okay. In Egypt, we have got the city of Alexandria. This is the most important Hellenistic city. If there's any Hellenistic city you probably should know, it's Alexandria. This is going to be the biggest of the Hellenistic centers. It's going to have a population of over 1 million people at its peak, and it also housed an incredibly important center for scholarship and learning at the Museion, or the Great Library at Alexandria, which we tend to think of today as a single building. We think of a library as one building that houses books, but the library in Alexandria was more of a complex of buildings and wasn't just a place to house documents, but it was a place of scholarship and learning as well. And it was the capital of the Ptolemaic kingdom, if I didn't already say that. Antioch, very important city of the Seleucid Empire, probably the most important and largest city of that empire, also famous for its library. A number of these cities are going to have libraries during this period. Seleucia, which is in Mesopotamia, was the original seat of power for the Seleucids. It's a territory that they'll eventually lose as that empire, which on this map is the largest of the Hellenistic empires, ultimately morphs probably more than any of the others territorially and will dwindle progressively. So we'll look at that rise and fall later. Pella and Macedon, that would be the capital and most important city up in the Macedonian territory north of the smaller Greek city-states. Pergamon on the coast of Anatolia. This is a minor Hellenistic kingdom, but also has produced some really amazing architecture and art, and will become an important ally of the Romans. So eventually it will be Roman territory, not through conquest, but the kings of Pergamon actually give the kingdom to the Romans. They bequeath it, to use a fancy term, to the Romans. Becomes one of their first Hellenistic land holdings after that. And we'll cover that very briefly later. And then the island of Rhodes is worth mentioning. It was an important commercial, cultural center. It had a very important navy, shipping power, and it also had a large library, which specialized in rhetoric. Okay, so those are some of the big cities. Of course, this is just a scratching of the surface, but let's get past those cities and focus on the really complex material, beginning with the death of Alexander the Great. 323, remember, he was on his way back, or at least he promised to be on his way back to Greece after his troops had threatened to mutiny when they were in India. He doesn't get any further than Babylonia. In Babylonia, he settles down and dies at age 33. We talked about potential reasons for his death or potential causes for his death, but what we do know is that he passes control of his empire temporarily to one of his generals, a guy by the name of Perdiccas, who is appointed as regent. Now, the reason he is not appointing a successor king is because he doesn't really have anybody to take on that role. He left behind a pregnant wife, Roxana, who is yet to give birth to a son. He will have a son who is going to be born posthumously. Unfortunately, even if the child had been born, he would not have been in any position to rule. So while we're expecting a successor for Alexander, currently you have a regent. Now, a regent's function is to rule in the place of usually a child king or some other official king who might not be in a position to govern. Now, technically, there was a potential heir to Alexander who was older, and that would be his half-brother Philip. But his brother Philip was not mentally competent. There are some discussions about whether he had some kinds of disabilities, but he's definitely not in a position to succeed as king. So the power basically falls to Perdiccas, and this is going to be complicated. The story about what Alexander the Great actually said regarding who should succeed him, the question was posed to him apparently on his deathbed. This is according to a later source, DIADOCHI, who says Alexander responded by saying "hoti ta kratisto," which means to the strongest. What do you want to happen with the empire? He says, to the strongest, implying you guys fight it out. Whoever is able to, consolidate power, then that's who the empire goes to. And whether he said it or not is really not that important, because effectively that is what is going to happen. The generals are going to fight to carve off the territories that they would like to control, and it begins a long process of back and forth fighting, confusion, and eventually leaving room for a foreign power like Rome to come in and eventually displace all of them. So let's look at what happened. So again, Perdiccas kind of favors the idea that Alexander's son will one day assume the role of king. He and a few other generals would serve as guardians in the meantime. I'm not going to read through all their names: Craterus, Leonatus, Antipater. Some of these names we're going to see again later. Some of them were not. So I'm going to highlight the ones that are going to be the most important as we progress. Other of his generals favored that half-brother of Alexander's, Philip Aridaeus. Now, the compromise was that the child who was going to be born and named Alexander IV and his brother Philip III would be joint kings, but in name only. Neither one of them were going to actually do any ruling. Who knows down the road whether the child of Alexander would actually be capable, but we're never going to find out. Okay, so probably besides the point. The empire is divided in 323 at the partition of Babylon, where it's carved up into satrapies. This basically follows the Persian model. The Persians had governed their empire through the use of satraps, which are local governors over various regions. Alexander doesn't mess with that system. It was a pretty effective system. So the list of individuals, I know this is very small on the screen, so I'm not going to go through all these names. Half of them are not going to mean anything anyways, but all the territories are divided up among different generals for government purposes. Okay, still supposed to have the idea of a single empire, but that's not going to last for very long. We'll focus in on just some of the names at the top so you could see officially who was given what territory at that original partition. Philip III, since he was alive at the time the baby had not yet been born, is appointed nominal king of Macedon. And Perdiccas, who we just mentioned, is regent. He was given Alexander's signet ring, which gives him the authority, okay? The other generals are satraps. Seleucus, we're going to see later, he's going to be appointed basically the leader of the cavalry, the companion cavalry of Alexander, kind of the head of that aspect of the military. Antipater given position to govern Macedonia and the regions closest to Greece, Lysimachus, the region of Thrace, which is right next to Macedonia, Antigonid, basically Greater Phrygia, the region of Anatolia for the most part, and then Ptolemy is going to take Egypt. Those are the only names that I want to focus on because those are the names we're going to be tracing, following forward. Those are the ones in blue. Now here's a map. Harder to see the divisions on this map, but this map shows you the individual generals and the territories that they're assigned. I know it's all in pink, but you could see different shading in the pink if you've got a good screen, so you could see where everybody is located. You could see Perdiccas, his name is listed right there in Babylon, because that's where all of this is done, at that partition of Babylon. Now, what happens very quickly is Ptolemy, who has been assigned Egypt, hijacks Alexander's body. You know why he does this? Possibly because the possession of the king's body gives him some extra legitimacy. Really hard to say, but he does carry it off back to Egypt. It was on its way to Macedon, where it was going to be buried, probably in a family tomb. They have unearthed the tomb of Alexander's father, Philip II, at Vergina, but where he would have been buried, we don't know. It ends up in the city of Alexandria as its final resting place. And it's kind of interesting to figure out what's actually happened to this, because it was really a well-known gravesite and tourist attraction in the ancient world, the tomb of Alexander. It was housed right there in a building, a special shrine that was set up that was referred to as the Soma, which just means the body. So if you're going to Egypt to see the body, you know exactly where to go. Even the Romans, numerous emperors had actually gone to Egypt to see the tomb of Alexander the Great. He was such a renowned figure. Unfortunately, the tomb, the whole site, the body itself has been lost. So this would be a great archaeological project. I know people have actually tried to find it. Nobody has been successful in locating the tomb and burial place of Alexander, possibly under the city streets of Alexandria. The city, again, is still a thriving city today and has been, built upon and I guess remodeled over the millennia. There is one really interesting theory that I'll just throw out there. I'm not going to elaborate on it. There's a whole history as to why this may have been an explanation for what happened to the body, but some people have actually suggested that the body somewhere around the 9th century was carried out of Egypt and ultimately found its way into Venice, Italy, where it might reside today. Now, I'm not going to say that this is a well-documented theory or anything like that. I'm just going to throw it out there. I think it's the most interesting theory, but you could probably find some information on that. I'm not going to go. I need to, go further forward. Anyways, right after the death of Alexander the Great, one of the big things that happens back in Greece, and maybe not that big a thing, but really not a surprising thing at all, is the Greek city-states, which have always loved their independence, form another coalition to try to throw off the yoke of Macedon. They did this right after the death of Philip II. They do it right after the death of Alexander the Great. The Lamian War breaks out, which is going to be Athens and its allies fighting against the Macedonians. Of course, they lose, and you have a number of generals that defeat them at the Battle of Cronon in 322. Okay. Also in that year, back in Macedonia, Alexander's mother, Olympias, arranges for Perdiccas, the regent, to marry Cleopatra, the sister of Alexander. Now, this may have been to give him a little bit of legitimacy, possibly setting him up in a more official position. This is opposed, as you would imagine, by the other generals, Antigonid, Antipater, and Ptolemy being the three most important ones who oppose this. And this is ultimately going to lead to a fallout among the generals, the first real conflict that we have when Perdiccas then marches against Ptolemy on his way to Egypt. His troops mutiny at Pelusium. Perdiccas is assassinated. And one of his officers that was involved in the assassination is this guy, Seleucus, the leader of the cavalry companions. That's not going to be obviously good. So you've got no regent currently in the kingdom. What happens immediately afterward is there is a repartition of the empire. You have a new regent appointed. This is the partition of Tripardisus in 321, and the guy chosen for this role is Antipater. Now, Antipater is not going to hold the role for very long. He too is going to pass away within a couple years. 319, he dies. The third regent is a guy by the name of Polyperchon. Now, the problem that emerges is the son of Antipater, the former regent, Cassander, decides he should have been appointed regent after his father's death. This didn't manifest. He then makes an alliance with some of the other generals and is going to go to war with Polyperchon over that position. Now, in the midst of this, Ptolemy, back in Egypt, sees the opportunity to seize more territory, and he seizes the region of Palestine. Now, that region of Palestine is going to become really important. Now, politically speaking, of course, I mentioned in Palestine, you've got Judea, the kingdom of the territory of Judea is not an independent kingdom at this particular period. We're going to look at the history of the Hebrew people later on. But the reason this is important is not because of Jewish history for the most part, but because this is really the corridor that is the entry and exit way for trade in and out of Egypt. Okay, it's basically the great highway on the trade routes through the Near East. Ptolemy controls this. It's going to be a territory that's going to be fought over constantly afterward, as if that territory hasn't always been contested by all the great Near Eastern powers prior. Anyways, let's move on with a look at what the map has taken shape. Again, a lot of different territories, color-coded map this time, so it's a little bit easier to see. You can see in the green here, the Ptolemaic kingdom. This is a picture of it at its greatest extent, okay, which includes a number, mainly the region of Syria, a little bit north of Palestine, including the island of Cyprus off the coast. That's as large as it's going to get. Ptolemy was beginning that process at this point. All right, let's talk about the DIADOCHI. DIADOCHI, a term that refers to the successors of Alexander. So let's start with Cassander, and we'll work through a few of them. And let's focus on that power struggle in Macedonia over the regency. From 319 to 316, Cassander versus Polyperchon over control of Macedonia. Now, in 317, Cassander is able to drive him from Macedonia, and then he makes himself regent for Alexander's brother, Philip III. Excuse me. Cassander then invades Greece. Polyperchon has an alliance with Alexander's mother, Olympias, and they invade Macedonia with the help of her family. She is an Epirus princess. Epirus is a territory that is just slightly west of Macedonia, for lack of a better description. Alexander, remember, is half Epirian. And with aid, he's able to come back into Macedonia, forcing Philip III and his wife to flee. Ultimately, they are captured by Olympias and Polyperchon and imprisoned. Olympias then has Philip executed. As you would imagine, she doesn't want Alexander's brother or half-brother to be even nominal king of Macedonia because she favors the child of Alexander, her grandson, for that role. Okay, and that's the figure that Polyperchon is kind of regent for. Ultimately, Cassander moves on. Olympias besieges her at the city of Pydna. Polyperchon ends up fleeing into the Peloponnese, where he is really unsuccessful making any real comeback. By 315, the siege of Pydna is concluded. It falls. Olympias is captured and executed, and then Alexander's son, Alexander IV, and his mother, Roxana, are both imprisoned by Cassander. Cassander is beginning to consolidate his power in Macedonia. He then marries into Alexander's family by marrying Alexander's half-sister, probably setting himself up for position as king. It's going to be a little while before that happens. By 311, he actually has Alexander's son and the child's mother put to death. Okay, eliminating any potential rivals. Philip III is out of the picture. Alexander IV is out of the picture. Cassander is the only man really standing now in control of that territory. And then he signs a peace treaty with some of the other generals to kind of consolidate power. We'll talk about what happens at that peace treaty a little bit later. But by 305, he's made himself king of Macedon. And here you can see an actual coin with Cassander's face, a portrait on it. And on the back of the coin, the obverse, what it's called, you see Cassandro Basileus, meaning king. Okay, and that thing in the middle is a tripod. Okay, so he's declaring himself king, which is pretty bold because remember, he is not from a royal family. He is a usurper for the most part, but he's setting himself up as king, and a lot of the other generals are going to follow suit. Okay, and he's not the first one to actually do this. The first one to actually declare himself king is this guy, Antigonid. So let's follow Antigonid's rise to power very briefly. This is going to take place during those same years. Antigonid, he was set up basically in Phrygia, central Anatolia. But from 319 to 301, he attempts, probably most ambitiously, to reconquer Alexander's empire. He wants to take control of the whole thing. That's his goal. Now, his beginning conquests start with a conflict with Humanities, who's right on his border. Ultimately, Humanities is betrayed and executed by 316. Antigonid has consolidated that territory. And I'm not going to go through all the changing alliances because these generals are going to group up and team up against one another. And I may mention a few alliances here and there, but to make it more simple, I'm not going to try to get into all that. 315 to 311, Antigonid continues to push east, and as he becomes more and more of a threat, others form coalitions against him. By 315, he has seized Mesopotamia, Babylon, and he seized Susa, which is in Persia, forcing Seleucus, who is situated in Babylon at that time, to flee to Ptolemy for protection. Okay, now we're going to come back and follow Seleucus in a little bit. They're going to make an alliance with Lysimachus back in Thrace and Cassander back in Macedonia to stand against Antigonid, kind of boxing him in from different directions. This is what the map would look like as Antigonid is spreading out. The orange territory would be the territories that Antigonid is able to capture. Egypt in the yellow, Macedon in green, and then Thrace in the orange. Okay. They're basically 5 figures we're now going to be tracing. So let me just give you those names so that you can hopefully focus in on them. We've got Cassander in Macedonia, Lysimachus in Thrace, Ptolemy in Egypt, Antigonid, who is building this empire, and then the 5th individual is Seleucus, who is currently sheltered in Alexandria, but is going to come back to build a kingdom of his own. Okay, so let's take a look at this process. 314, Antigonid actually attacks Ptolemy unsuccessfully. He's defeated at the Battle of Gaza. His son Demetrius is one of the great generals of the ancient world. So when you see the name Demetrius, he is going to be the son of Antigonid, and he is going to be co-ruler with his father for a while. At this point, Seleucus comes back into the picture by seizing control of Babylon and ultimately Mesopotamia, which is where the Seleucid kingdom is going to emerge. And then in 311, you finally have a peace treaty between these guys. Antigonid in Asia, Cassander in Macedon, Lysimachus, Thrace, Ptolemy in Egypt. Seleucus doesn't sign the treaty at this point. But you are going to have a war over Babylon between Seleucus and Antigonid from 311 to 309. And what happens is Seleucus comes out as victorious, and we could say that this is the birth of what's known as the Seleucid Empire, named after Seleucus the First Nicator. You can see a statue or a picture of Seleucus on the screen. The other coin, if you note, is a picture of Antigonid the First, monophthalmos, meaning one-eyed. He had lost an eye. But the back of this coin, the obverse of this coin, also lists him as king because he is going to proclaim himself king. So the current morphing map is going to look a little bit like this. Antigonid's territory is greatly reduced. Seleucus is going to end up becoming the king of the largest territory. You can see the Seleucid territory in the light blue. And then I'll just keep moving so we don't spend too much time on the maps. In 307, the treaty is going to be broken. These treaties never last all that long, as you saw when we studied the Peloponnesian War. Athens and Sparta signed numerous treaties in the 5th century, some of them to last upward of 50 years. They never did. It was always within a couple years that, I was going to say peace breaks out, but sorry, war breaks out. So Demetrius, at this point, again, the son of Antigonid, frees Athens. They're trying to move into the Greek territory. Ptolemy attacks Asia Minor. Demetrius is defeated there. Demetrius ends up conquering Cyprus by 306. He attempts an invasion of Egypt and fails. Around this time, both he and his father become co-rulers and assume the title of king. Others follow this pattern. Like I said, Cassander does this, Lysimachus does this, Ptolemy does this, and at this time in 305, Seleucus himself declares himself a king as well. We'll talk about Hellenistic kingship at the end of this PowerPoint, but this is the new trend, monarchy throughout the region. I shouldn't say new trend for the Greek world, not really for Macedonians or for the Near East, so I probably misspoke. But in 301, a very large battle is waged, the Battle of Ipsus. Antigonid and Demetrius are decisively defeated by Seleucus and Lysimachus, and in this battle, Antigonid is killed. Now, he's the first of the DIADOCHI to exit the picture. But within a decade or so, the rest of the successors are going to pass away, some through war, some through natural causes. So with the removal of Antigonid, we now have 4 remaining successors to follow. We've got Seleucus, who has the yellow portion of the map. You've got Lysimachus, the ruler of Thrace, who now controls Thrace plus portion of Anatolia, Cassander back in Macedonia, and Ptolemy in Egypt. So let's see what happens with these 4. Let's cover the death of the DIADOCHI, the end of a generation. 301, Antigonid dies, like we said, at the Battle of Ipsus, where he's speared. In 297, Cassander passes away due to illness. Demetrius, Antigonid's son, sees that as an opportunity to seize control of Macedonia, actually has the child of Cassander murdered, so there isn't going to be an heir to the throne as far as Cassander's dynasty is concerned. Of course, Lysimachus moves in to get rid of Demetrius, and he does this with the help of another figure who we're going to look at a little bit more later, particularly when we get to Roman history, but I will mention him one more time today. This is a guy by the name of Pyrrhus of Epirus. He is king, kind of a relative of Alexander the Great. He's a king of the region of Epirus. He had just actually taken throne very, very recently, and him and Lysimachus team up to push Demetrius out of Macedonia, but then he himself is pushed out by Lysimachus, and Lysimachus temporarily and very briefly holds Macedonia as his own territory. That would be by 285. Demetrius is defeated in the same year fighting with Seleucus. He's imprisoned by Seleucus and actually dies several years later while still in prison. 3 years in prison, and the guy passes away. There's a statue of Demetrius Polyarchides. It is his nickname. This means the besieger of cities. Like I said, a very great general in his time. Ptolemy I passes away in 283 as well, of old age, 84 years old. Lysimachus ends up dying 2 years later in 281, killed while fighting Seleucus, leaving Seleucus as the last living contemporary of Alexander the Great. There's a coin with Seleucus's face on it as well. Now, he, of course, is going to pass from the picture within a year. 281, he is assassinated by the eldest son of Ptolemy I, Ptolemy Keraunos. Now, this figure is not king of Egypt. He was the oldest son of Ptolemy, but he ends up in Thrace. So let's now move on to the successors of the successors. The guy who actually succeeds Ptolemy in Egypt is his other son, Ptolemy II, Philadelphus. In 283, he inherits the Ptolemaic kingdom. It served as co-regent with his father for a while, so it makes the transition fairly smooth. The older brother, Ptolemy Keraunos, actually fled Egypt and goes to the court of Lysimachus in Thrace. Now, you can imagine Ptolemy having pretty much control of that region, which is why he's involved fighting Seleucus after the death of Lysimachus. So we're going to see him kind of try to take territory over the Greek world in just a second. But Antiochus I, he is the successor in 281 of Seleucus, so he succeeds to the Seleucid Empire. I've color-coded these on the screen so that you can kind of see the major 3 kingdoms: Ptolemaic kingdom, Seleucid kingdom, one more to go in just a little bit. But Ptolemy Keraunos, who is, like I said, in control of Thrace, holding on to Lysimachus' throne at his death, attempts to defend Greece from a Gallic invasion that takes place in 280. Basically, from 280 to 277, you've got a migration of Celtic tribes into the region of the Greek mainland. Coming down from the north, this is a time when you have a lot of Gallic migrations or Celtic migrations through southern Europe into Italy a little bit earlier, basically in the 4th century, you've got these invasions of Italy. You've got the invasion of Greece currently, and also it's going to be moving tribes into Anatolia. But around 280, Bulgios advances into Macedonia, and the conflict with Ptolemy Chronos results in the death and decapitation of Ptolemy, taking him out of the picture by 279, which leaves Greece itself and Macedon somewhat undefended. And what happens is the figure who moves in to stop the Gauls, who had now pushed down as far as Delphi, is a guy by the name of Antigonid II Gonatas. He is the son of Demetrius, the grandson of Antigonid I. Now, this gives the Antigonid family control of Greece and Macedonia, and we have that third big kingdom, the smallest of the three actually, the Antigonid kingdom founded. Okay, so there are the three kingdoms, and we're going to try to follow these three. So we've gone from 4 to 3, the Ptolemies in Egypt, the largest is Seleucid territory, and then the smallest, the Macedonian Antigonid territory. Okay, all of which are going to found in a dynasty. There'll be more confusion ahead. Bear with me. All right, we're down to 3 kingdoms. This is the current map as it stands. Notice there are a lot of little smaller territories we're not including on the map. But let's move on and introduce Rome. Rome is definitely a kingdom you have heard of, but it's slowly going to become involved in the Greek Hellenistic world, but somewhat reluctantly. At least it's going to appear somewhat reluctant. The Pyrrhic Wars are going to be the first engagement between the Romans and an actual Macedonian army. This takes place in Italy. Pyrrhus, who I introduced shortly a few slides ago, is called into Italy by the Greeks of southern Italy. And remember, that territory is known as Magna Graecia. You've got lots of Greek colonies in southern Italy. At this particular time in history, Romans were expanding down into that territory, threatening the Greek cities, and they request aid of Epirus. Pyrrhus comes to their rescue, and he fights the Romans at numerous battles in southern Italy, defeating them each time. The Battle of Heraclea, the Battle of Asculum, defeats the Romans, but in the process loses so many guys in doing this that it's almost not worth it. And from this pattern of winning barely, we get the term Pyrrhic victory. If you've ever heard of a Pyrrhic victory, it comes from Pyrrhus' name. And this is an apparent quote that he uttered after his victory at Asculum. He says, "If we're victorious in one more battle with the Romans, we will be utterly ruined." So how long can you keep this up? The Romans, unfortunately for Pyrrhus, could keep it up quite a bit. The Romans had a much larger manpower to draw from. And in 275, the Romans do win a rather indecisive victory at Beneventum, but a victory nonetheless, ending the Pyrrhic Wars and basically taking over the rest of Italy in the process. Now, they own Greek territory, but they are going to become more involved in the actual Greek world in just a second. So the way I'm going to cover the rest of this period is through kind of a timeline. If you're looking at the screen, this might be a little bit small. I'm working off a very old PowerPoint, but I'm going to try to highlight the important wars and events, but I don't want to go into too much. You can see down the center is going to be our timeline from 280 to 230 currently. We're going to divide the screen into two. We're on the left, we're going to see Rome and their involvement with the Antigonids of Macedon. And on the right-hand side, we're going to look at the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt and the Seleucid kingdom and their conflict, because we could look at these as two series of wars that are going on simultaneously. The Syrian wars are going to be waged between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. There are 6 major Syrian wars, basically over control of the region of Palestine and Syria. Now, the names you don't need to worry too much about. All of the kings of Egypt are going to be Ptolemies. One of the maybe good things about the Ptolemaic history is that everybody has the same name. So if you're ever asked who is king of Egypt during this period, you could always safely say that was Ptolemy. The numbers are going to get confusing, though. The kings of the Seleucids are going to have various names, but a good number of them, the most important ones, are going to be the ones named Antiochus. Now, I want to just highlight I don't want you to get confused, the name Antiochus with the name Antigonus. The Antigonids are in Macedonia. Antiochus is the name of a Seleucid king, or numerous Seleucid kings. So try to keep that straight to reduce frustration. But in the first 4 Syrian wars, you're going to see the Egyptians win every time. Okay, so it's going to be kind of redundant. Now, all these wars, like I said, are over territory, but some of these wars are going to have some other palace intrigue involved. I'm not going to get into a lot of the details, but maybe I'll hold off on a second. I'm introducing these little gray boxes, some other wars that are going on that don't directly involve these big Hellenistic kingdoms, but are rather important and worth mentioning, and some of these we're actually going to look at a little bit later, particularly when we do Roman history. So on the Roman side of the scale here, we've got the First Punic War, which takes place from 264 to 241. This is Rome versus Carthage, a power that is not involved in a Hellenistic territory, but a very important power in the Mediterranean nonetheless. We'll cover these wars later. Second Syrian War, 260 to 253. Between Ptolemy II and Antiochus II, and then the Third Syrian War, 246-241. This is one of the Syrian wars that actually is fought not just over territory, but over the assassination of the sister of Ptolemy III by the ex-wife of Antiochus II. A little bit confusing, but it's called the Laodicean War. It's kind of a revenge war for the most part. Anyways, let's move on. Parthia, 238. You have the emergence of another player in the east, which is the group known as the Parthians, which we covered when we covered the Persian history. This consolidation of Parthian power in the northeastern portions of Iran are basically, this group is going to emerge as the Second Persian Empire for the most part, and will progressively expand and seize territory from the Seleucids. Okay, so we're going to watch that on the map in just a second. So here's where the Syrian wars are basically being fought over that territory circled on the map, and here's where Parthia emerges. Okay, you can see the current size of the Seleucid kingdom. We'll note that that's going to progressively shrink. Now, moving on with the timeline, let's get to the Fourth Syrian War, 219-217. The new figure that's introduced is a guy by the name of Antiochus III. Now, Antiochus III actually loses the Fourth Syrian War, but we're going to keep an eye on him briefly because he's actually going to emerge as one of the most important Seleucid kings. As a matter of fact, he's going to be known as Antiochus the Great. Now, fighting him at the time was Ptolemy IV, and this is not a typo. I know you might look at the slide or the show and note that I've got Ptolemy IV written in a very different way. I actually did that on purpose when I was putting this PowerPoint together because so many people are not aware that the Romans actually did have another way to write the number 4. It wasn't IV, but you could actually write it this way too. That's just as legitimate, just not as common. Okay, so that's not a mistake. The Second Punic War takes place, and this is worth stopping and slowing down just briefly to mention. The Second Punic War between Rome and Carthage takes place from 218 to 201. Now, the reason this is relevant is because Rome is at war with its archenemy, a guy by the name of Hannibal, and he was defeating the Romans in battle after battle in this war. He actually had invaded Italy, and in the year 216, he defeats the Romans at the Battle of Cannae in southern Italy. Such a huge defeat, it looked like Rome was basically done for. Now, Hannibal had too small an army to actually besiege the city of Rome or successfully take the Romans out, and was always in search of allies and support. Because the Romans had been so decisively defeated, the king of Macedon, Philip V, at the time, saw this as an opportunity to seize control. He had wanted territory along the Illyrian coast, territory that Rome had control over. Sees this as an opportunity to seize control of that territory and goes ahead and signs an agreement or an alliance with Hannibal. And this brings about the First Macedonian War. Philip V probably saw this as a safe bet. Rome is previously occupied with this war with Carthage. How are they going to stop him? Well, Rome ends up taking the tactic of kind of avoiding war with Hannibal in the meantime and turning their military attention towards Philip, which was not what he was expecting. So from 215 to 205, the First Macedonian War. Rome gets an alliance during this war with the small Hellenistic kingdom of Pergamon in Anatolia. Okay, and that's going to be a long-standing relationship, which I had already mentioned prior. It ultimately ends with the defeat of Philip V. Okay, so on the screen you'll see in red the victor of any of these wars. I probably should have pointed that out before so you knew who won each of the wars. So Rome in the First Macedonian War, Ptolemy IV in the Fourth Syrian War. Right after this defeat of Philip goes ahead and signs an alliance or forms an alliance with Antiochus III against Egypt. That would be in 202. Now the Egyptians are going to end up forming an alliance with the Romans. So you're going to see how these series of alliances is going to kind of perpetuate war, something that really has never stopped throughout human history. 202, two more wars break out, the Second Macedonian War and the Fifth Syrian War. Rome continues to win in Greece. As a matter of fact, at the conclusion of the Second Macedonian War, they go so far as to proclaim the liberation of the Greek cities from Macedonian control at the Isthmian Games. The general Flamininus proclaims all the Greek city-states free in 196. On the other front, the Syrian War progressed a little bit longer, Ptolemy V versus Antiochus III, and here Antiochus III earns himself the name Antiochus the Great by defeating Egypt, taking control of Palestine, and that's going to remain in the Seleucid hands, but only briefly. We're going to look at what happens in just a second there. In the meantime, after the conclusion of both of these wars, the Seleucids turn their attention now to the Greek mainland. And this brings about a Roman Seleucid War. This is usually just referred to as the Seleucid War, the Syrian War in Roman history. But to distinguish it from these other Syrian wars, we're going to call it the Roman Seleucid War from 192 to 188. And the Ptolemies basically call Rome in to help out defending Greece from the growing threat of Antiochus. And in 192, this war begins. Antiochus is attempted to invade Greece. In 190, the Romans are going to win a few major victories against Antiochus, who incidentally is employing at the time Rome's old enemy, Hannibal. And the Romans actually are able to defeat Hannibal. The Scipio brothers, who are one of which, and Scipio Africanus is the great Roman general who defeated Hannibal at the Battle of Zama earlier in the Second Punic War, is present in this contest. But ultimately the way it works out is Rome again wins a victory, saves Greece, does not take control of Greece, but does take hostage the young Antiochus IV, brings him back to Rome in 188. He's going to be the future king of the Seleucid dynasty. So here's the current map. You can see Rome in blue. Their growing territory is still not very large. We'll move on and look at what happens after this. From 190 to 130, you have the Third Macedonian War. 171 and 168, Perseus, the son of Philip V, attempts to reassert Macedonian dominance over the Greeks. Fails. Rome comes in again, defending the Greek city-states, and at this time ends the Antigonid dynasty, more or less. They carve the territory of Macedonia up into 4 separate territories, which are going to be given republican governments after the Roman fashion, and that is the end of this one kingdom. The Sixth Syrian War, not worth noting, 170-168, Antiochus IV now maintains control over the region of Palestine. But let's talk about what's going on in Palestine, because Antiochus IV has a really notorious reputation among the Jews, and we're going to look at this a little bit more when we do the history of the region and the territory when we cover ancient Israel. But in 169, he raids the temple in Jerusalem, which was the most sacred site for the Jewish community. And some of the other things he does, trying to force Hellenism on the Jewish culture, results in a revolution, a revolt that breaks out in 167. This is known as the Maccabean Revolt. It's a very famous revolt. It is a successful revolt. The Jews break free from Seleucid control by 164 and form their own kingdom, okay, with their own king. It's going to be known as the Hasmonean period of ancient Judea. But the Seleucids, this does indicate sort of a weakening of Seleucid power. That once great empire is slowly dwindling. They have now lost control of that region of Palestine. There is a Fourth Macedonian War, 150 to 148. There is no more kingdom that we can call an Antigonid kingdom, but you do have a pretender to the Macedonian throne by the name of Andriscus, who asserts himself very briefly, defeated by Rome, and then you've got an alliance of Greek city-states, again in Greece, try to rise up, and there's a conflict with Rome in 146. It results in the destruction of Corinth, the defeat of the Achaean League, and at this point, 146 BC, Greece becomes a Roman province. Okay, the Romans were probably tired of coming in and being involved in these wars far from home, helping the Greeks out over and over again, but they do take control directly at that time. It does seem to indicate a little bit of a reluctance of Rome to come in and govern directly, but I guess they figure we're kind of doing that anyways, we might as well stay and make it official. In 139, Demetrius, king of the Seleucid kingdom, loses Iran to the Parthians. The Parthians had grown so powerful at the time that the largest chunk of the Seleucid territory is taken away. And then shortly after that, 133, the little kingdom of Pergamon in Asia is given to Rome, bequeathed by King Attalus III at his death to the Roman people. And then in 129, Antiochus VII is killed fighting the Parthians, and Mesopotamia is then lost to the Seleucids. So the map looks like this. We're down to two powers, two Hellenistic kingdoms at least. The Seleucids, greatly reduced, and the Ptolemies, which are still fairly secure in Egypt. Those are the two in the yellow. The Parthians are now in the green. The Romans have all the territory in the orange. Let's continue the decline. There's not much left to go. Things continue to shrink. It's down to Rome versus the Seleucids. The last century. Armenia ends up rising and fighting with the Seleucids, ultimately defeating them and virtually ending the Seleucid dynasty around 83 BC. Tigranes the Great of Armenia basically defeats them successfully and decisively. You do have a resurgence of Seleucid power briefly around 69 under Antiochus XIII, but it's just a small fraction of its former territory and a very brief resurgence, because very soon after this, the Romans are going to move in to the region with the campaigns of Pompey the Great, or Pompeius Magnus in 63. He brings a conclusion to the Seleucid dynasty. Seleucid Empire is finished by 63. We're going to look at Pompey when we do Roman history. He's a big name at the end of the Roman Republic. This leaves only one final kingdom, which is the Ptolemaic kingdom. You can see the growing Roman territory slowly encroaching on the Hellenistic world. You have an independent Egypt still. That is all that's left of the Hellenistic kingdoms. So let's finally turn our attention to that last kingdom, Rome versus the Ptolemies. 51, the throne of Egypt is taken by Ptolemy XIII and his sister Cleopatra VII. Co-kingship, but only briefly co-kingship, because Ptolemy XIII ultimately pushes his sister off the throne, and she turns to the Romans for support. At the time, Julius Caesar came to Egypt. Nothing to do with what's going on in Egypt so much as his pursuit of his enemy Pompey. I said I'll get to that later. But during the Battle of the Nile in 48, Ptolemy XIII is killed. He drowns, and Caesar, who had been supporting Cleopatra as claimant of the throne, basically installs Cleopatra as the sole pharaoh over Egypt. And she's going to be the last pharaoh of Egypt, and probably the most famous of all the Ptolemaic rulers. She has a love affair with Caesar that produces a child. So when it says Cleopatra has a cesarean, this has not anything to do with how she gives birth, but this is the child's name. Caesarion, also known as Ptolemy the 14th Caesar. Okay, he has a boy and will not really rule. His mother is, like I said, the official last pharaoh. 41, BC, which is after the death of Julius Caesar. Cleopatra takes up with one of his generals, Mark Antony. She has a few children with him who are actually installed as kings and queens over various regions in the east. This process of Roman and Ptolemaic involvement together and division of the eastern portion of the Roman Empire between them ultimately leads to a conflict with Mark Antony's former partner Octavian, which culminates at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, where Octavian defeats the forces of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, coming out as the sole ruler of the Roman territory, and he'll eventually become the first Roman emperor. We'll cover this in more detail a little bit later. But Cleopatra, as the result of all this, ends up committing suicide in 30 BC. She would have been taken back to Rome as a prisoner after the end of the war. She didn't want to do that. She kills herself. That was the last Ptolemaic ruler. Ptolemaic dynasty is finished, and Egypt becomes just one more province in the greater Roman Empire. So the map at the end looks something like this. At the time of Octavian, everything in yellow and green, all the different shades, are all territories directly ruled by Rome, Egypt being the last territory added as far as our story is concerned right now. So by 30 BC, there are no more major Hellenistic kingdoms or territories. Rome is master of the Mediterranean for the most part. Now we're going to be picking up with Rome in our next historical overview. We've got a few more sessions to cover Hellenistic material. Like I said, it was confusing and chaotic. The last thing that I want to cover, though, is the cultural changes. What's going on? Why do we call this a Hellenistic period and not just an expansion of Greece? Well, it's because the East is going to be Hellenized, and Greece itself is going to become somewhat Orientalized. And that might be a little bit of a overstatement, because as we've seen when we looked at the history of the Greek people all the way from the Bronze Age forward, there has never not been a period where the Greeks are involved with Eastern culture, right? The world at the time was incredibly interconnected, even in the Bronze Age, right? We saw the collapse around 1150 of the entire Eastern Mediterranean, this whole systemic collapse that resulted in the destruction of the Mycenaean city-states, the collapse of the Hittites, the sacking of numerous cities, and the near invasion of Egypt by the Sea Peoples. That entire collapse was as large as it was because the region had already been so interconnected economically and politically. Well, that was still going on, as we saw when we emerged in the Archaic period after the Greek Dark Ages. You still have incredible Phoenician influence in Greece, which resulted in the alphabet's introduction, resulted in all kinds of other artistic elements that we call the Oriental phase in the Greek pottery and art. So this is really nothing completely new, but it's going to move further forward and faster. And this is due to Alexander's vision of a unified empire, culturally speaking. Remember, he was tutored by he was tutored by Aristotle. And Aristotle had a passion for unity. He not only focused on unity in his philosophy and coming up with kind of a unified philosophical system, but possibly passed on that passion to Alexander, who came with a more political approach. All right, so you're going to have this multicultural empire set up, and it begins with the activity of Alexander himself. He begins to adopt during his lifetime Persian style, Persian dress, Persian custom. And this is controversial, at least among his generals. They saw this as somewhat of an abandonment of Greek custom and Macedonian tradition. Alexander temporarily took up the proskynesis. I'm trying to remember the name of the habit or custom of proskynesis, which was something that the Persian kings demanded, which is the idea of bowing down, laying face down on the ground in front of the king. Now, for the Greeks, when you prostrate yourself on the ground in front of a king, it's a kind of a sign of worship. So this would be something the Greeks may do in respect to the gods, but they never did this to the kings. Even the great King Agamemnon in the Iliad was never somebody people bowed before. Now, in the East, as you know, you have had all along an incredible tradition of god kings, right? The Egyptian pharaohs. You've got kings going all the way back to ancient Sumeria, particularly in the Akkadian period, or the Akkadian Empire period, kings declaring themselves divine and tying themselves to divinities. Well, Alexander had the same attitude. It's not new. It shouldn't be surprising that he proclaims himself in a certain way as God. We already saw that he claimed to be the son of Zeus. Now, this offends his generals, and he abandons the practice after some opposition, but he continues to adopt other Persian elements. He employs Persians themselves and satraps, governors. Some of his governors were satraps that had previously served under Darius III. Persian soldiers are incorporated into his army, even as officers. He marries a foreign bride. Roxana, the mother of his child, or one of his children, by the way, is a Bactrian princess. All right, she's not Greek. He also married two other Persian princesses, even picking up the habit of polygamy, which is not something practiced by Greeks. And then he forces, even worse, his generals to take foreign brides. The wedding at Susa in 324, which was ultimately a failure, was an attempt to do this. Okay, marrying Greek and Persian traditions together, literally speaking. Now, the process of Hellenization, which was originally objected to by Alexander's generals and had this opposition, ultimately is going to gradually follow nonetheless, right? It's just kind of this natural evolution through the close interconnection of these cultures. You're going to have Greek introduced to that world and the other elements introduced to the Greek world, okay? And the large and most successful amalgamations or developments of this kind of mixed culture take place in the large urban centers, places like Alexandria. And you actually have a lot of Greeks migrating into cities like that for military purposes, administrative purposes, or for scholarship roles, particularly in places like Alexandria, which again had a large center of study. So this is going to become the best example of a cosmopolitan city, multi-ethnic, and multicultural city. Other times, the Hellenization is forced, as we saw with Antiochus IV with respect to the Jews. Now, that's a particularly failed attempt, and you can imagine why that would be, because the Jewish people were very different from the Greek people in religion, which is at the core of their worldview. You're talking about polytheism versus monotheism, so you can understand why there would be a Maccabean revolt and a pushing out of the Seleucids by 164. Okay, so that's an example of forced Hellenization that fails. Other places, like I said, it was much more successful. So let's look at some of the Greek exports in the process. Now, the Greeks, of course, are the masterminds behind the early birth of philosophy. You've got political theory and other elements of philosophy that are going to pour into these areas. Okay, art, architecture, literature, and language are also going to have a huge impact, particularly language. Greek becomes the international language of business and trade, and as a form of Greek that's referred to as Koine, which just means the common Greek, to distinguish it from Homeric Greek or Attic Greek or some of the earlier dialects. This is the common Greek, and it's going to be the second language most people would know in the ancient Near East. Most people that were engaged in trade probably would have picked up some Greek in addition to their native language. Okay, and because of this, most of the literature throughout the Near East, whether it's produced by Greeks or non-Greeks, is going to be in the Greek language. So one example of this would be the very important translation of the Hebrew Scriptures into Greek, known as the Septuagint, which was done under the support of the Ptolemies in Alexandria. Among the community there, the Jewish community realized you need a Greek version of their Scriptures because the majority of Jewish people were no longer reading Hebrew the way they once were. Okay, Aramaic, by the way, happened to be the more common spoken language among Jewish people, but Greek would have been very, very important. So you have this very important work called the Septuagint. LXX is the abbreviation. We'll talk more about that when we do ancient Israel and their religion. Greeks imported and assimilated other Eastern ideas. So with religion, you're going to start to see elements of Zoroastrianism come into the Greek world. You're going to see a development of non-Greek mystery cults. Now, we'll talk about these, I think, in our next session, so I'm not going to talk much about them, but you do have these foreign gods and goddesses now, Isis in Egypt, Cybele in Anatolia, Mithras in Persia, that come and emerge into this world. Now, the Greek concept of a mystery religion we've already covered, so it's really, again, a blending of religious ideas. And then Christianity is going to be another one, which is often grouped in with the mystery cults. We'll spend some time with that later as well. Here's just a visual example of kind of this harmonizing of styles. This is a statue of the goddess Isis, clearly an Egyptian goddess, but not in an Egyptian artistic form. She is clearly in the form of an idealistic, classical style Greek statue. Okay, you could tell that it's Isis because of things that she's carrying and wearing. But other than that, you really wouldn't be able to tell it from a native Greek deity, okay, like Hera. Now, the other thing, and I've already mentioned this, is this mode of divine kingship. This model for kingship that the Hellenistic rulers adopt comes from that older tradition, like I said, of the god king. The Ptolemies do this. You actually can see it really interestingly in their artwork. So here's a wonderful statue of Ptolemy I depicted as a pharaoh. Right? Pharaohs were gods, so you have the same thing going on in the iconography of Egypt, but not just in Egypt. You have this among the other kings as well. The other statue that you see is possibly a Hellenistic ruler. It's also been identified as a Roman Republican general. The identification has been debated by scholars, but notice it's in the classical nude style of Greece, and this is a way that the Hellenistic kings often depicted themselves to kind of take on godlike proportions. This is the way you would see a statue of Zeus, for instance. So again, that goes along with this idea. And just to show you, again, how the kings often did consider themselves as gods, you can look at some of the names of Hellenistic monarchs, like Antiochus II, who takes on the name Theos at the end, which means God. Okay, or Antiochus IV Epiphanes, which is kind of the manifestation of a divinity on earth. So you've got that tradition going on. So you've got these large monarchical kingdoms now superseding the smaller independent polis. The democracies are displaced, and this is going to have an impact in religion and in philosophy, which we're going to look at very soon. Last few things I want to cover, just a little look at some of the monuments and architecture, because another big change, and I shouldn't say a big change, but a unique twist is going to be in how they change their style in this period when it comes to monumental architecture. It becomes very large, highly decorative buildings and monuments. As a matter of fact, a number of the great wonders of the ancient world, the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a number of them were Hellenistic monuments. Here are 2 of them, neither of which stand today, but we're looking at a model or a drawing, respectively, the Mausoleum of Halicarnassus, which is a tomb for Mausolus. The tomb is actually named after him. So if you've heard of mausoleum, it comes from the ruler known as Mausolus and his wife. And you can see the size. If you're looking at this model, the door on the bottom gives you a little bit of an idea how tall people may have been. And it was probably a fairly large doorway. But this is way larger than you need for a tomb, right? It's not about practicality and burial. This is about a show, an ostentatious show of wealth, power, and strength. That's a little bit redundant, but you know what I mean. So you're going to see a lot more of this kind of stuff being built. The Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, another one of the 7 wonders in the other picture, is again lost to us, but this was a massive, massive temple. Some of the great temples during the Hellenistic era dwarf the more famous temples like the Parthenon back in Athens. So this would have been much larger. The Parthenon probably could fit inside the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus. Now, some people think the art and architecture of the era are gaudy, overdone, overblown, and not as graceful or perfect as the earlier classical period, but this is what we're dealing with. So the mausoleum, the Temple of Artemis, the altar of Zeus at Pergamon. I don't have a visual for that one, but this is a really wonderful thing. If you have a chance to look that picture up on the internet, you'll find it's in the Berlin Museum currently, but the altar of Zeus is this massive, massive monumental altar. And altars are used, if you don't know, for the sacrifice of an animal. But here's an altar that is so large, you could sacrifice like an entire herd of cattle on top of this thing. The Colossus of Rhodes, very famous statue, and kind of the model for the Statue of Liberty. You know, way larger than you need any statue to be. And of course, it doesn't last for very long because the Aegean is prone to earthquakes. The statue falls not long after it actually is erected. Lastly, art. We're going to be looking at a change from the classical idealistic style, which we discussed with some of your presentations, to the realistic style. Now, I know you guys are going to be presenting again on Hellenistic art, so I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but I'm giving you at least one example. My favorite Hellenistic statue, the Laocoon. And what distinguishes idealism from realism is not the detail with the anatomy. I'm not talking about realistic in the sense that they're capturing the anatomical proportions and musculature in a better way than they were during the classical era, because classical artists had already mastered that. But it's the difference between the statue being detached from the world around it and serene and perfect in its appearance versus the realism, which captures the emotion and the strain and the stress of the statue being situated in a real-world environment. So here, Laocoon, you can see the agony and expression on his face as he and his sons are being killed and strangled by these serpents. This is from the story of the Trojan horse, if you're familiar with Greek mythology. But there are a number of other great examples I could have included, like the Nike of Samothrace or the Aphrodite of Milos. Those are some that you may want to include in a presentation on Hellenistic art when you do that. But anyways, that's probably all that I need to cover with respect to, hold on a second, with respect to the Hellenistic world. Like I said, it's a little bit chaotic, a little bit crazy, a lot of names, a lot of places. But if you got anything at all out of it, I want you to see how Alexander the Great, without a plan for succession, left behind an empire that very quickly fragmented. His idea of a unified empire definitely didn't manifest. You may end up with somewhat more of a unified culture in the long run, but unity, definitely not. The fragmentation of the empire resulted in 3 large chunks: the Antigonid dynasty and empire in Greece, the Seleucid dynasty and empire in Asia, and the Ptolemaic dynasty and empire in North Africa. And then with all of that interfighting, you have Rome by itself come into the chaotic world and take possession, which is where we're going to pick up when we get to our next historical overview. So for now, we're going to stick with the Hellenistic world just a little bit longer, and we're going to cover in our next session the Hellenistic mystery cults, and our session after that, we're going to take a look at some of the philosophical schools. Or I may switch them and do them in the other direction, but we'll see.